You never forget the moment when your life is turned upside down, especially when that moment involves a pact that should never have been made. My name is John, and this is the story of how my desperate attempt to save my only son, Alex, dragged us into an abyss from which we are still trying to escape. The disease had taken hold of Alex's little body, so severe and relentless that the doctors, with their pitying gazes, could do nothing but prepare us for the inevitable. As a parent, you imagine you're prepared for anything. But the truth is that nothing can prepare you for the possibility of losing your child. My wife had passed away a few years ago, leaving a void that only Alex could fill. Her illness not only threatened to take him away from me, it also threatened to extinguish the last flame of her presence in my life. In an act of pure desperation, I clung to the only spark of hope I could find, hidden in the dusty pages of an old book in the local library. The book, a compendium of ancient rituals and supernatural pacts, seemed to whisper promises of powers that could defy death itself. I knew in the back of my mind that playing with such forces was wrong, but the image of Alex smiling again, free from pain and fever, erased any hesitation. In the dead of night, under the flickering light of candles, I invoked something that I swore was the solution to all our problems. The entity that presented itself shrouded in shadows and promises offered a deal: Alex's health in exchange for an unspecified future favor. Desperation has a way of masking fear, and at that moment, I would have sold my soul 1,000 times over just to see Alex cured. And then, against all logic and reason, the impossible happened. Alex got better. He recovered with a speed that defied all medical explanation, leaving the doctors baffled and me temporarily relieved. But as I was soon to discover, some pacts come with a much higher price tag than one might imagine. The darkness that now surrounded us was only the beginning of a nightmare that I had inadvertently made us a part of. The miracle of Alex's recovery was, at first, a relief that seemed to brighten our darkest days. The house was once again filled with the sound of his laughter, music to my ears, desperate for good news. However, this joy was soon mixed with an atmosphere of strangeness that began to settle around us, as subtle as the changing of the seasons, but just as inexorable. Objects began to disappear without explanation, reappearing in impossible places. Shadow and light seemed to play with each other, creating figures that danced on the walls of our home, always in the corner of my eye, disappearing when I tried to focus my attention on them. At night, the dreams began. They were so vivid that I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the shadowy figures who visited me, whispering promises and threats, had shared my bed. The devil, or whatever it was I had invoked, seemed to remind me through these dreams of the pact we had made, a rope around my neck that tightened every time I tried to forget it. Alex's health, however, remained immaculate, a beacon of normality amidst the growing sea of chaos that was beginning to engulf our lives. But then, he started talking about an imaginary friend, someone I never saw, someone he said taught him games and told stories. Stories that, for a child his age, were too complex, too dark. Games that involved symbols I vaguely recognized from the book I wished I'd never found. Each new day brought with it the feeling that we were being pulled deeper and deeper into a vortex of inexplicable events. The invisible presence in our house started to become bolder, moving heavy objects, turning off the lights, leaving messages on the fogged-up windows. We were caught in a web of supernatural events, with each thread pulling us deeper into the unknown. At this point, I knew that I had unleashed something that was far beyond my comprehension or control. The promise of a covenant fulfilled, of a life saved, had become the curse of a haunted existence, a constant reminder that some prices are too high to pay. As the days passed, the strangeness in our home escalated, shaping itself into palpable terror. One morning, while dressing Alex for school, I noticed marks on his skin. Not just any marks, but symbols that burned in my mind with a terrifying familiarity. symbols I had seen in the pages of that cursed book. These marks, they couldn't be the work of a child at play, nor did they appear to be natural injuries. They were like a seal, a claim. Paranoia began to take hold of me, a constant companion that whispered doubts and fears at every turn. The people in town, once friendly, now looked at us with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if they could somehow sense the darkness that had nestled in our home, in our lives. I knew they were talking about us, whispering theories and suspicions about what had happened to the poor family who now lived in the shadow of something unnameable. In search of answers, I plunged once again into studying that book and other similar texts, looking for a way to undo what I had done. The stories I found only served to increase my despair. Stories of lives destroyed, fates corrupted, all linked by pacts similar to the one I had made. And then, amidst this maelstrom of terror and regret, the entity returned, no longer as a whispered promise in the shadows, but as a clear and terrifying demand. It came to demand the favor it had promised, a dark ritual that I had to perform, an act that made my blood run cold just imagining it. I refused. I refused with every fiber of my being, even though I knew that this refusal could have even more horrible consequences for us. But how could I do such a thing? How could I plunge even deeper into darkness, knowing the cost it would have for my soul, for my son's soul? The supernatural phenomena intensified in response to my refusal. The house seemed alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. The nightmares became unbearable, not only for me, but also for Alex, who began to fear nightfall, begging not to go to sleep. His big eyes filled with a fear that no father should see in his son. I was at a dead end, trapped in a macabre game where every move seemed to lead us closer to the abyss. The entity had made its move, and now I had to find the strength to make mine. With the refusal of the ritual demanded by the entity, I knew I had to find a way to protect Alex and me from even more terrible consequences. The search for a solution led us down dark paths, exploring even more ancient and forbidden texts and rituals in the hope of finding a way to annul the pact. With every page turned, the reality of our situation became clearer and more desperate. We were trapped in a web from which it seemed impossible to escape. The intensification of supernatural phenomena was palpable. Our house, once a home of love and laughter, had now become a stage for an incessant storm of paranormal activity. Objects flew through the rooms without explanation. Shadows moved against the logic of the light, and the whispers that seemed to speak directly to the soul, filling it with despair and fear, became a sinister constant. It was then that I sought out unconventional help, a renegade parapsychologist whose reputation for dealing with the paranormal was both questioned and feared. He told me, with a look that mixed pity and reproach, that pacts with entities of that magnitude could not simply be undone. You opened the door, he said, and now it can't be closed. The truth of that statement weighed on me like a tombstone. As if that wasn't enough, the situation with Alex began to deteriorate even further. His behavior changed in subtle ways at first, but soon these changes became impossible to ignore. He talked to himself, lost in conversations with his imaginary friend, but the content of these conversations was anything but childish. They were dark speeches, full of anger and violence, which a child his age shouldn't know. The look in his eyes sometimes was not that of my son. I was facing a terrible crossroads, with the weight of my past decision crushing me at every step. The pact I had made in the hope of saving my son now threatened to consume us completely. Each passing day brought a new terror, new proof that the entity would not rest until its wish was fulfilled. The reality of our situation was a bottomless pit of despair, and I found myself on the edge, looking down, trying desperately not to fall in. I needed to find a way out, a way to save my son from this darkness that I had brought into our lives. But how could I fight against a force that seemed omnipresent, omniscient, and, above all, insatiable? When the entity finally revealed the true nature of the favor it was demanding of me, a shiver ran down my spine. The ritual it wanted me to perform was unthinkable, something that went against every fiber of my being. It was a human sacrifice. I refused, no matter how much it might cost me, no matter how desperate our situation became. I couldn't, I wouldn't. That moment of refusal marked a turning point, not for the better, but for an even deeper spiral into darkness. The evil influence on Alex grew in ways I could barely comprehend. He began to display a strength that didn't seem natural for a boy his age. And his eyes, there were times when looking into them was like looking into an abyss. He spoke languages I had never heard. His words filled with an anger and power that made the air around him seem heavy, charged with a dark energy. Desperate to find a way out, a way to protect my son from forces I could barely understand, I decided we should run away. We isolated ourselves in an old country house, hoping that physical distance could somehow protect us from the presence that had invaded our lives. But no matter how far we went, the shadow of the Pact followed us. A constant reminder that you can't just run away from the supernatural. The decision to confront the entity directly came from a place of absolute despair. I could no longer watch my son being consumed by this darkness. Armed with knowledge of ancient texts and rituals I barely understood, I tried to expel the evil it had invited into our lives. But the entity's power was immense, and my attempts to fight it were like whispers against a hurricane. The ritual failed, leaving us more vulnerable than ever. The following night was the most terrible of all. The house seemed alive, shaking with a supernatural fury. The walls whispered with voices that weren't human, and the darkness thickened until it seemed solid. It was a demonstration of power that made me realize how insignificant our efforts against such an entity were. I had terribly underestimated the cost of the Pact, and now it seemed that we would pay with our own sanity, perhaps even with our souls. With each passing day, it became clearer that there was no easy way out, no trick or ritual that could free us. The pact I had made, hoping to save my son, had tied us to a fate much darker than I could have imagined. The situation with Alex reached a critical point when he was completely possessed by the entity, a transformation that left me simultaneously terrified and desolate. My son, the boy I had sworn to protect against everything and everyone, was now the dwelling place of a force I could barely understand, let alone fight. His eyes, once full of innocence and curiosity, now reflected a dark abyss, a window into a realm that none of us should witness. It was at that moment that I realized the true price of my decision. The favor was not just an act of servitude or a single ritual. It was a claim on our souls, an indelible mark that would transform our lives into instruments of the entity's will. Desperate, I devised a plan to confront the entity once and for all, using the only resource I had left, a blood ritual, my own blood, in the hope of offering something of sufficient value to negotiate Alex's freedom. With a heavy heart and a mind haunted by doubt, I prepared the ritual in the deep darkness of the night, the air around me charged with a gloomy expectation. The words of the ancient texts burned on my tongue, each syllable a physical effort, while the blood flowed, drawing ancient patterns on the worn wooden floor of our house. It was then that the world around me faded, and I found myself transported to a nightmarish dimension, a realm where the notion of time and space was lost amid unspeakable horrors. In this place of despair and darkness, I faced the entity on its own turf, a duel of wills where every second stretched into an eternity of agony. The battle was both physical and spiritual, each blow a testament to my determination, each defense a testimony to my refusal to give in. Against all expectations, I found a way to deceive the entity, a moment of weakness that I seized to claim Alex's freedom, wrenching him from the clutches of darkness. When we finally returned to our world, Alex's transformation had been undone. He had no recollection of the events that had taken place, his mind shielded from the true extent of the terror we had faced. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that we had won, that the darkness had been banished from our lives forever. But victory came at a cost. The marks of that confrontation remained with me, both physically and spiritually. The reality of our situation became impossible to ignore. Although we had escaped the entity's immediate influence, the pact it had made continued to weave its shadow over our lives, a constant reminder that certain choices have consequences that echo far beyond what we can foresee. In the calm that followed our battle in that nightmarish dimension, a dark truth began to unfold. The victory we had achieved was, at best, a temporary respite in the storm that had taken hold of our lives. I began to realize with growing horror that the price of our freedom was more complex and insidious than I had imagined. The pact had not been completely annulled. Instead, it had metamorphosed into a new form of curse, one that began to eat away at my health and sanity with relentless voracity. In the days that followed, my skin began to be marked with strange symbols that burned with a cold, unrelenting pain. My nights were haunted by dreams of despair and darkness, each one leaving a physical mark on my body when I woke up. It was as if the entity, unable to claim Alex, had turned its malevolent attention to me, marking me as its vassal, a living reminder of the pact it had made. So we decided to try and start again somewhere else, away from the shadows that clung to our old home. We moved back to the city, seeking anonymity among the crowd, a chance to live our lives away from the direct attention of that dark force. But the darkness inside me continued to grow, a spiritual cancer that no doctor could diagnose or treat. I could see the worry in Alex's eyes, his inability to help only widening the chasm between us. The transformation in my own nature became evident to everyone around us. The community, once welcoming, began to treat us with suspicion and fear, as if they could sense the mark of darkness I carried. Inexplicable and tragic events began to occur around us. Terrible accidents that seemed too coincidental to be mere coincidences. It was as if the curse I had brought upon us was spreading, touching lives beyond my own. It was in that moment of despair that I discovered the cruelest truth of all. The entity had left a mark on Alex that none of us had noticed. A mark that linked not only me, but also him to the darkness. A curse that threatened not only our lives, but the lives of anyone who dared get close. It was a revelation that broke me, the realization that despite all my efforts, I had failed to protect my son from the true nature of our pact. Now, facing the reality of our situation, I knew I had to make a decision. A decision that could be our only hope of escaping the clutches of the darkness that I had unknowingly invited into our lives. But this hope came with a price, one that I feared I wouldn't have the courage to pay. In the quiet of our new life in the city, the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find some peace began to fade fast. The darkness I had brought into us, an indelible mark of the pact, continued to manifest itself in increasingly terrible ways. I felt my body and mind deteriorating day by day, a deterioration that had no medical diagnosis and no hope of a cure. It was as if the very essence of the pact was consuming me from the inside out, leaving me as a shell of the man I used to be. Alex, for his part, seemed to grow more distant. He could see the marks on my body, the deep circles under my eyes, and although he didn't talk about it, I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew something was deeply wrong, but he didn't know how to help, and this powerlessness seemed to weigh on him as much as it did on me. Our relationship, once marked by joy and unconditional love, was now shadowed by secrets and painful silences. Our attempt to start again was marked by isolation. The community around us, perhaps sensing the darkness that followed us, kept their distance, leaving us in a social limbo where neither friendship nor comfort could reach us. And yet the supernatural events and terrible accidents kept happening, a series of misfortunes that seemed almost deliberate, as if an invisible hand was orchestrating the chaos around us. It was then that I came face to face with the bitterest truth of all. The mark left on Alex, an invisible scar that tied his soul to mine and to the darkness of the Pact. It was a revelation that destroyed me, the realization that my own son was cursed to walk a path marked by the darkness that I had inadvertently chosen for us. That mark wasn't just a reminder of my failure to protect him. It was a death sentence, a promise that the darkness would never leave us alone. In the loneliness of our existence, I knew I had to do something, anything, to try to right the wrong I had committed. But what could be done when every previous attempt had only plunged us deeper into darkness? The solution, when it finally came to me, was as terrible as the situation we were in. I realized that the only way to perhaps free Alex from this curse was to sacrifice myself, in the hope that, with my death, the pact would finally be broken. This decision, made in the depths of despair, was a step in the dark, a last act of love from a father who had failed on all other fronts. But even this hope was doomed to failure, for when I reached the point of carrying out my last desperate plan, I discovered that the darkness had one more cruel twist up its sleeve. In the twilight of our existence, I walked with a weight that seemed to crush my soul more and more. The decision to sacrifice myself, a choice made in the deepest desolation, was my last hope. However, the entity, a presence that now seemed almost familiar in its constant oppression, had other plans. The night I decided to act, a revelation came to me, not as a whisper, but as a scream in the darkness. There was no escape, neither for me nor for Alex. The pact, once made, was eternal, a cycle of torment that would not end with my death, but would simply continue, unwavering and relentless. This realization was a cruel blow, knocking down the last defenses of my already frayed spirit. I had believed in my innocence that I could somehow cheat death, cheat the entity. But the truth was that we were entangled in a web far more complex and ancient than anything I could comprehend. The darkness didn't just want a soul, it wanted a lineage, an eternal servitude that would extend far beyond my lifetime. The supernatural events and accidents around us intensified, as if the entity was enraged by my attempt to escape our agreement. The community, already distant, became even more hostile, fueled by rumors and fear. There were looks that burned us, whispered words that cut deeper than any blade. Our isolation became complete, an island of despair in a sea of normality. Amidst this maelstrom of chaos, a terrible truth began to crystallize. The mark left on Alex was not just a symbol of our pact. It was a guarantee that the darkness would perpetuate itself. He was destined to walk down a dark path, a road that I had inadvertently paved for him. This thought tormented me, the idea that my son would carry this burden long after I was gone. In the solitude of our self-imposed exile, I turned to daily rituals, a desperate attempt to protect Alex, to keep the darkness at bay. But every gesture, every word spoken in the old languages, was a reminder of my failure, my inability to protect what I loved most. We were trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair, a labyrinth of shadows from which there was no way out. Every day that passed was a reminder of the darkness we had invited into our lives, a darkness that now seemed to consume everything it touched. The idea that I could somehow free Alex from this curse began to seem like a fantasy, an impossible dream in the face of the relentless reality of our pact.